Muy buenos días.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Con su permiso, secretario ejecutivo, vamos a dar inicio
We will open
desde una condición híbrida.
this session. This is a hybrid meeting. We are in the Celso Furtado room in the headquarters of ECLAC, but we are also in San Jose de Costa Rica simultaneously and will be participating from both places. One of the iconic documents of ECLAC, which is the preliminary overview of the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean. We are
A través de todas nuestras plataformas, Zoom,
with Zoom, Live, CEPAL, YouTube channel, website, and social media, official social media of our institution. We greet everyone who is with us here at the Celso Furtado room and the journalists who virtually or face-to-face are following this launch of the preliminary overview of the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean. The presentation, of course, will be made by Jose Manuel Salazar Sirinat. This time he is with us from San Jose, Costa Rica, and by the director of the Economic Division, Daniel Titelman. And they'll provide us with the main conclusions of this report. Also in our central venue, here we have Javier Medina, Assistant Secretary, Chief Demand and officers of the Economic Development Division that have contributed to the preparation of this report. Cristin Caton, Ramón Pineda, Esteban Pérez, Francisco Villarroel, Noel Pérez, who are also here in this room. Special thanks to the directors of ECLAC and colleagues of the institution that are with us this morning. As always, we'll first present the document, and after that, we'll have the session, the Q&A session for all those colleagues who are connected to this event. Please send your questions via chat in the Zoom platform or to the email conferenciaprensa@cepal.org. So I now give the floor to our Executive Secretary, Jose Manuel Salazar Sirinat. Greetings, and you have the floor. Please, go ahead. Yes, thank you, Guido. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and welcome to the presentation of our last iconic report of 2024, and that is preliminary overview of the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean 2024. As Guido said, as it is a virtual meeting, so I'm speaking to you from San Jose, Costa Rica. I would like to thank Daniel Titelman, Director of the Economic Division of ECLAC, and all the team that prepared the report. The names have already been mentioned, and also the other divisions of ECLAC that have contributed with the statistics, international trade, and also regional headquarters and country offices. The content of the report is the one that you can see in the following slide. These are 5 chapters: global context, 1 about the space, or rather the restrictions to that space for growth that the region is facing. Number 3 is indicators of economic activity. Number 4, growth forecasts for the closing of this year 2024 and for the future 2025. And it is disaggregated country by country. And finally, policies to face the low growth capacity trap, where most of the countries of the region are. I will present the global context, and then I'll give the floor to Daniel Titelman for the rest of the report. To begin, in the global context, these are the main findings, the main messages. First, that world growth has had a soft landing in that reduced inflation without inducing recession. However, the main trade partners of the region are going through this year 2024 and 2025 through a low growth period. And this does not help the countries of the region. And secondly, that world inflation has led to lower interest rates, and central banks have had to change monetary policies to lower interest rates. And also there has been a dollar appreciation and possible consequences, and there are high financial costs. Third, the rate of growth of the trade growth rate in goods and services is maintained low. Although there are more goods, more commodities, however, the export is low. And also the uncertainties and negative impact of possible growth of protectionism and geopolitical tensions. So here we see the world economic growth. It is around 3.2% in the last years. It is 0.6 below the growth of the last 20 years. As it is a world average, it's quite significant. For 2025, it is expected that the main trade partners of the region will slow down the growth. The United States goes from 2.8 to 2.2 in 2025. China goes from 4.8 to 4.5. Eurozone 0.8 to 1.2 or 0.2 in 2025. Emerging economies, developing economies are the ones that maintain dynamism and development, with 4.2 growth rates in 2025. This year and the next are the main contributors to the growth of world economy. It is estimated that the contribution of those economies to world economy will go from 53 to 67% in the period 29. So in that group, India is the main one with 6.5% or 6.5%, but India is not yet a trade partner for Latin America and the Caribbean. In the next slide, you can see how worldwide inflation has gone down. On the left side, you can see the monthly annualized inflation rate in the Euro area, in the United States, and UK. You can see the peak at mid-2022 and subsequent reduction. In general, developed economies, inflation is converging to the target goals of 2%, and therefore central banks have initiated a reduction in their monetary policy, as you can see on the right side graph. Although these rates have gone down, still they are high, and the geopolitical uncertainty also impacts on the dynamics of rate reduction. In this next slide, you can see several dynamics which are relevant for the region. On the left side, you see the favorable behavior of 4 variables whose combination is the main explanation for the reduction of the inflation rate. You have the value chains index in blue, energy price in orange, and relation between supply and demand of labor in gray. Labor markets in the U.S. show a space for supply to accommodate demands without major pressures in the salary dynamics. All those 4 trends are favorable for the countries in the region. Now, in contrast, the trend for dollar appreciation on the graph of the center, that is a depreciation of Latin American and Caribbean currencies, on the other hand, could generate inflationary pressures. And the other relevant trend is the ascending trajectory of sovereign bonds in 10 years, saying that financial costs are continue high. As to world trade, in this other slide, we can see the dynamics of the world trade on goods and services from 2000 to 2024, and the averages from 4 to 4 years. You can see an average growth rate of 6% per year between 2010 and 13. The growth of world trade has not recovered since the subprime crisis in financial terms, and these are bad news for a region that bets on exports as the growth engine. From 2020 to 24, the average growth rate of world trade is only 2.4% per year, as you can see there. However, this is the trade of goods and services. The services rate growth rate has been higher than that of goods, but from a lower basis. And most of the exports of the region are exports of goods and not services. Now, we can see the rise in tariffs and other protectionist measures, plus geopolitical rivalries, raises a scenario with important threats for trade in the countries of the region, where surely there will be questions, and we will discuss this more broadly. Now it is a pleasure to give the floor to Daniel Titelman so that he can continue with the rest of the presentation.
En lo que continúa de la presentación, el primer, como ya se mencionaba en el contexto que mencionó el secretario ejecutivo del balance preliminar, vamos a estar examinando un poco el espacio para el crecimiento que tiene la región y cuáles serían las restricciones.
And first of all, beginning with the external sector in the region, as from the region exports and the balance of payment of our countries, we see that a concern in terms of exports in the region shows a slower dynamic movement than world exports, and regrettably, the region, the rates of growth of the exports of goods and services in the region is growing at a smaller pace than the world dynamic, and as mentioned, that is already low. A second issue, which is good news, is that the region maintains its access to international bond markets. That is important, but costs remain relatively high, and we'll see how those high financial costs restrict the space for macroeconomic space, and thus restrict the capability to grow. A third message is that despite the region is receiving resources, and the region has access to the debt market, the net transfer of resources is still negative. And what we mean by this is that what is received by the region, the gross reception of capital, we subtract that the gross exit of capital plus the dividends with a slower interest, and thus we see that capital is leaving the region less than what is being received, and that restricts the scope to grow on the part of the region. And another issue that ECLAC has often brought to the fore is that the increase of financial costs and the increase of debt means that the payment of interest is still on an upward trend, and that restricts the capability for growth of our countries. Here we simply want to show you the dynamics of the exports of goods and services from the region that have been growing at an average rate which is smaller than that of the world. And if you notice at the world average between 2015 and 2024, the export of goods and services grew by 2.8%, whilst in Latin America and the Caribbean, that growth was only 2.1%. And this difference has become much more acute when one compares the figures for 2022, 23, and 24. There you can see an increase in the differential of the growth of exports of goods and services of the region vis-a-vis the world. And that is complex in a region that has bet on exports as an engine for growth. It is complex because many of the models and many of the growth dynamics of our region, of our countries, rely heavily on the export sector in a world where exports of goods and services is on a downward trend and the region is growing at a smaller pace. Well, that hinders the capability for growth of our countries. An issue that we believe is important because it impacts many countries of the region, especially Central America and the Caribbean and others, is that the flows of monies received from abroad by people from countries of the region that live outside the region, sent to the region, and that has had a significant increase and reached an amount in 2024 of around $39 billion, which is a tremendous amount of money. And this money is very significant in many countries. In Honduras, it represents around 25% of their GDP, in El Salvador 23, Guatemala 19, and then it drops in different countries. But in many countries, this is a very important flow that explains the dynamic of growth to a large extent via the dynamics of consumption. So it's a flow that has been maintained, that has an upward trend, and that explains the dynamic of growth and the macroeconomic stability of many countries of the region. As already mentioned, the region is obtaining access to international markets, but we must be careful when we talk about the region. We must understand that these figures, 70 or 80% of these figures, is explained by 4 or 5 countries of the region. It is not a heterogeneous situation in all countries. Some have more difficulties in terms of access, and in September 2024, we were experiencing a figure of around $98 billion in terms of the emission, in terms of bond emissions, and this was divided into around 44 million in terms of sovereign issue of bonds and around 54 million in terms of non-sovereign debt, which implies the private sector, public companies, and other businesses. Now, an issue that we would like to highlight here is the importance of thematic emissions in terms of the total percentage. By thematic emissions, we refer to those bonds related to the emission of bonds devoted to environmental and social aspects. In other words, money or debt that has a specific is earmarked for social and environmental aspects, and that has been an innovating formula for financing of the region that has been growing because it creates new alternatives in the international markets. And you can see that in 2018 that wasn't even 0.1% of the total emissions or issues in the region, and today in 2024 it represents around 28% of total issues, and the maximum was in 2023, representing practically 35%. And this has opened up new ways for financing, but it has also meant that the cost of these bonds are lower on average than the bonds in traditional markets, and that is also important. In the last 2 columns of this graph, we show you the total issues, the total average coupon of these emissions, and in thematic emissions, that was significantly lower than traditional issues in 2018. 5.2 versus 3.6, and despite the fact that they are coming closer in 2024, that was 6.5 and 6%, half an average point. But in terms of the interest rate, that implies a significant amount of money. And what we want to highlight is that the region is accessing the debt market. There is a heterogeneous access. And this is a new novel instrument, which is thematic bonds, which has an advantage in the sense that they involve lower financial costs, and that is relevant. The central issue here is not only to gain access, but how to reduce financial costs. That, as we will see, is an important issue for many countries in the region. As already mentioned, despite access to the debt markets, the net transfer of resources has been negative in 2024 in net terms. was $52 billion, and that is the reception of capital minus the exit of capital, the net payment of dividends, plus the payment of interests. And that is a tremendous problem for the region, because one of the main problems that we face is that in order to face the low growth trap together with productive development policies, we also require the capability to mobilize financing. And this is a key issue that we will look at in our conclusions, and which is indeed a challenge for the region. And another issue that we would like to focus on, and ECLAC has repeated this on many other occasions and documents, is that the payment of interests, given that the external debt has increased and therefore financial costs are increasing, is becoming an important restriction. And there you can see that in 2024, close to $65 billion were paid in terms of interests on average in the region. The region also receives interest from resources outside, but only received, or abroad, which was only 24 billion, which is a low figure compared to the 65 billion dollars paid in 2024. And there were therefore a major challenge is how to deal with this flow of resources so that it does not become additional restrictions to growth, as mentioned by the executive secretary. Now in more macro and more domestic terms in the region, in fiscal and monetary terms, so the main messages of the overview is that the region still has limited fiscal space and also primarily restricted by the high levels of debt, which is something that we will look at later on. The payment of interest, as mentioned, restricts that fiscal space and generates major challenges for fiscal policy. We also have a chronic problem of low taxation revenues and high evasion, which is a complex equation where we have to strengthen the fiscal space in order to enhance the use of fiscal policy. In inflation terms, what one could call the last mile has been much more difficult in the convergence of inflation. As in the rest of the world, inflation has converged to its downward goals, but the dynamic of this convergence to the target ranges has become much more complex in the last few years, and we will have a look at why, and that conditions the policy of central banks and monetary policies in our countries, and that is an extremely relevant aspect. And despite the fact that the rates of policies, and as mentioned by the executive secretary, depreciation has been an important element for our countries because it has two effects. On the one hand, for countries that export more manufactured goods or goods with more technological incorporation, and depreciation in the exchange rate makes them much more competitive and supports their exports. So that is for part of the region, because the countries that export more raw materials and agro-industrial products, that dynamic doesn't really impact its exporting capability. But it has made the management of monetary policy much more complex, because to the extent that the depreciation in our currency has increased, that exerts pressure upon inflation rates and generates pressure so that central banks may have less scope to lower interest rates of monetary policy. And that has been the duality of the problem of depreciation that we have experienced. And that has meant that despite the fact that we see that in most countries of the region they have reduced their monetary policy rates, they still remain greater than the neutral policy in most countries. And the neutral policy is that rate which is neither expansive nor contractive, and by being over and above the neutral rate stays or leads to a contraction of the economy that also limits the scope for growth. As mentioned, the fiscal policy is still limited both in Latin America and the Caribbean, but an issue that is important and that we will review is that in the case of Latin America and also in the Caribbean, the deficit in the case of Latin America, the primary deficit is 0.3%, which is a deficit that any economist would say is quite reasonable when it comes to fiscal accounts, and therefore the region has made an effort to establish fiscal consolidation after the tremendous expenditure during the COVID pandemic in 2020. And as you can see there, the primary deficit during 2020 went up to 4%, and now we have undergone a consolidation process where the primary deficit in the region is 0.3. ECLAC has repeated this over and over again in the sense that the fiscal response by countries in the region was correct, and that we had to have a very active and counter-cyclical fiscal policy in order to face up to the impacts of the pandemic. After that, we have conducted a consolidation of that effect. But if you look at the global deficit continues to be very high, which is 3.3, and the major deficit difference between these two is the payment of the debt, which represents 3 percentage points of the GDP, and that is strongly restricting the fiscal space. In the case of the Caribbean, the situation is even more complex because the Caribbean has been able to establish a primary surplus after an important deficit in 2020 that reached minus 4.1%. It has conducted a very important change, and it now has a surplus of 0.4 points of the GDP in primary terms. It had a primary surplus of 1.4% of the GDP last year. But as occurs in the rest of Latin America, you can see that primary surplus of 0.4 becomes a global deficit of almost 2.7 percentage points of the GDP that reflects the payment of interest of the foreign debt. And that is one of the major restrictions that Latin America has. And you can see that countries are making a fiscal consolidation effort, which is very significant, but high financial costs continue to restrict the scope for fiscal policy. And that is an issue which, in our view, is crucial in order to expand the space for growth. Here I simply show you the dynamics of public debt of countries in the region, and as you can see, in Latin America, the maximum was achieved in 2020, which is practically 56% of the GDP for the central governments, and now we're at a rate of around 52% of the GDP, which shows that countries have reduced their indebtedness dynamic after the pandemic, but the debt is still high. In Caribbean countries, we also see an increase, a very significant increase in 2020 during the pandemic, where that reached almost 85.7% of the GDP for the public debt of central government, and is now close to 66.4% of the GDP, which evidences that there has not only been a consolidation of fiscal accounts in terms of primary deficits, but also an effort to reduce the level of debt over the GDP, and regrettably the increase of financial costs has meant that effort has been less productive and has paid less than what we would have wanted in order to expand our scope for growth. As mentioned, the payment of interest have reached a historic level. This year, 3% of the GDP, as you can see on the right-hand side, and you can see that in between 1990 and 23, it was you can see the levels there, and from 2020 onwards, we are close to this year we're approaching 3%, which is a historical figure. When we see that this restricts the space for fiscal policy, if you can look at the graph on the left-hand side, you'll be able to see that.
Sorry, I changed the slide. It is highly compared with the total expenditure structure of the central government. If you see primary current expending is 15% of GDP, the capital spending 3.4%, and interest payment is 3% of GDP. And that shows how much weight it has in terms of expenditure for our country. And to zoom in, look, in 2012, the payment of interest was 45% of expenditure of education. And today it is 70% in education. It was, today it's 86% in expenditure in health, and social was 52%, and today it's 57%. ECLAC says that an important part of productive development policy has to do with the subjects of increasing education, health, human capital, and generate a social universal protection capacity is key to having greater dynamics for growth. And look, the payment of interest has kidnapped the resources we've left for these three areas. And there you see payment of interest with public investment, and you see interest payment has gone up, public investment has gone down, and that is quite complex. If you want to make more dynamic the productive structure, when a region invests little, Latin America and the Caribbean only invest 20% as compared to other regions in the world. The domestic mobilization capacity of our countries, I mean the fiscal capacity, is restricted by the low public income or revenue and a high evasion level. That is the idea, to reduce tax evasion. In 2024, it has been stable the last 4 years. The tax revenue for central government was 16% of GDP. And if you add other income, it was close to 18.6%, a figure that has been maintained stable. And it is low, and that is the challenge of the region if we want to strengthen fiscal stability. And here, evasion and avoidance do not help, and both rates are very high in the region. On the right side, for the average of Latin America and the Caribbean, evasion is 6.7% of the average GDP, regional one, 6.7. That's a lot, which is equivalent to $433 million. And there you have a VAT on the right side, and it is 2.1%. There is less invasion of VAT than income tax, which is 4.6%. And the policy challenge there is enormous in order to how to expand the space for growth, room for growth in the economy. As to inflation, as the executive secretary said, there's a convergence of inflation worldwide and regionally towards target ranges, and it has slowed down in recent months. Here, after the peak of 2022, where inflation was almost 8.2%, the general one, it has gone down significantly, and it is converging in the underlying one as the different measurements of inflation to target ranges of central banks, which is around 3%. So the inflation dynamics is downwards, but as I was saying, the last mile is always more difficult to tread and reach convergence. And one of the factors behind this drop of inflation has been the dynamics of the food prices and services. In the case of services, there is rebounds of the prices of services because of the rise in energy. And that restricts the capacity of central banks to keep on reducing interest rates. As you see, there is an appreciation, a dollar appreciation globally, and that is not an exception in the region. So there is a depreciation of our currencies that affects some countries more positively. The exporting competitiveness, in others it's neutral, but it is affecting the convergence of the last mile to convergence, that is. In this context, most of central banks of the region are reducing their rates. I won't go into this graph that is like a spaghetti bowl, but you see that it trends. All the interest rates are downwards. In some countries, more cautious, but in others are below the neutral tax rate or the rate. In Chile, the interest rate went down to 5% in Chile. It should be now there 5% for Chile, but all of the interest rates are going down, maybe slower than wanted, but they're going down. What is happening with economic activity? And with this, we are closing. The main messages of economic activity is that there is a low growth capacity and a slow job creation for the region. That is concerning, quite concerning. The executive secretary has said that one of the messages is the low growth capacity trap for the region. It's a concerning subject, one of the challenges of ECLAC, how to address, how to face this trap jointly with the other traps. The economic activity is driven mainly by consumption, with a low participation in investment and no contribution of net exports. That is concerning. One of the challenges is how to make more dynamic the investment. And as we saw, the export rate of the region, it grows less than that of the world, and that is concerning. And if you disaggregate factors of growth, you can see that they are generating a small positive effect or negative in some. So consumption is key. And therefore, remittances are so important in some countries due to a lack of consumption in many of the countries. The growth rates of 24 and 25 will remain low. That is the low growth capacity trap. And the region is losing weight in the contribution to world growth, whilst the contribution of other regions is growing. And that is not only means that you lose economic weight, but also multilateral voice. The economic dynamics, and I'll go faster with the numbers. You can see quarterly how there will be a slowdown, deceleration starting 22, deceleration trend. The second quarter of this year, it increases to 2.6% as that of 2023, but in the third and fourth quarters, you can see a trend to deceleration of economic activity. As I was saying, if you see the different components of expenditure, we see that private consumption is the leading and driving the economic activity, and not the investments nor net exporters. And that is concerning, because investment is the bridge between the short and long term, and that is together with productivity. But here we are considering investment. And jointly with this low growth, and that the pace for job creation is quite slow, and this year, interannual validation rates, it's the lowest one since 2021, and it is of 1.7. You can see that the average between 2019 onwards was 2.1%. The rate of creation of interannual variation of employed persons, and this has to do with the low growth dynamics. When we see or zoom into the labor market, there are 3 or 4 issues of great concern. One, although the unemployment rate has gone down between 2018 and 2019, it was 8% and started to go down after we recovered from the pandemic to 6.9, to 6.2, 6.1. And also, the labor participation rate has gone down. So the participation rate explaining those persons linked to the labor market versus those that withdraw from the labor market has gone down. So there is less people looking for a job. And so this indicator has to be seen with great caution. Another subject is the gender gap between men and women. If you see, unemployment rates are significantly higher for women than for men, 7.5 versus 7.2, and there is a gap of 2.3%. Also, in the participation rate, there is a significant difference, 74.3 for men and 51.8 for women. And that also makes a gap in participation, very significant. So the dynamics of labor markets, although unemployment has gone down, but is made complex because of gender inequality and participation issues. And in other studies of ECLAC, this has been raised due to a low labor activity. It is a fact that impacts on labor markets. And the interannual salary variation has gone up. The average salary has gone up. The average one went up 3.4%, and the minimum wage went up 1.4%, and last year 1.7%. The average salary in 2022 had been negative, 2023 no growth, and this year it did. And that explains the growth dynamics as well. In this complex context, what are the forecasts for Latin America and the Caribbean? A growth of 2.2% is projected for this year and 2.4% for 2025. It is a low growth, as the executive secretary said. We continue in the low growth capacity trap, and that is the challenge of the countries in the region. Latin America and the Caribbean in 2024 was 2%, and without the Caribbean, and in South America, it would be growing 2.1, Central America 2.8, Mexico 1.8. You have the list there by countries, but in fact, there are countries that are growing significantly. Venezuela, 6.2%. Paraguay also is growing, and Dominican Republic also is one of the countries that has grown high. And in 2025, Latin America and the Caribbean will go from 2.2 to 2.4, although the growth is still low. It is below the world expected growth, which was 3.2. We are 1 point below the world growth, expected growth, and that is bad news. And Latin America will be growing 2.3, South America 2.2, Argentina will be going up next year. And then you can go and see each country in detail. As to the Caribbean, an expected growth for this year is 11%, if we include Guyana, that has a spectacular growth because of the oil reserves that were discovered. And if Guyana is excluded, it's around 2.5, and the Guyana expected growth is 41.5% there. For 2025, the Caribbean will be growing 5.7%, and if we exclude Guyana, it's 2.6% or 2.7. Yes, there you have the list of each country, and the region is going to contribute less to the world growth in the medium term. Between 1990 and 2023, Latin America and the Caribbean contributed around 0.5% of world growth. Between 2024 and 2029, as to the forecast of growth in the region and the world, Latin America will be contributing less, 0.3%, and that is a reflection of the low growth capacity trap of the region, and that weakens the voice of the region in the world scenario, and that is the challenge of the region. And now, to conclude, what is proposed from ECLAC in order to face this low growth capacity trap?
The proposals are in two levels. First of all, the importance of mobilizing resources, which we believe is fundamental. We have seen that there are many financial restrictions when it comes to fiscal policies, financial restrictions to private mobility. The idea is to increase the mobility of resources. And secondly, of course, the productive development policies that lead to an important change in the dynamics of productivity, investment, and growth. Those are the two strategies that are being discussed and that are presented in the overview in order to present this trap of low growth capability. The mobilization of resources refers to the strengthening of public finances, and that involves expanding the fiscal space via improving tax revenues and their progressive nature, and that involves reducing tax evasion and tax avoidance. It also implies improving tax revenue expenditure, the exemptions that are introduced to make some sectors more dynamic. And in the region, regrettably, the evaluation leaves a lot to be desired with these efforts that consume a lot of efforts. Tax revenues are around 3.8% of the GDP in Latin America. To improve the revenues of physical persons, which is a way to improve the taxation structure, and there is a big difference when we compare Latin America and the OECD in terms of tax revenues. To use innovating financial instruments, thematic bonds, as we saw, have increased their participation, and novel financing formulas that can help governments and the private sector to mobilize resources. And finally, of course, to improve the efficacy of public expenditure in order to reduce social gaps. In other words, not only to improve the financing of the public sector, but it is also fundamental to increase its operation efficacy and efficiency and the use of those resources. An issue that we also feel is relevant at a more macro level, at a more generic level, is how to better supplement monetary exchange and prudential policies. So one problem that the region faces is that at a monetary rate, despite the fact that rates have dropped, this is still contractive, and therefore we need to expand the toolbox of monetary policies via the use of a more prudential regulatory policies, a better management of exchange rates and reserves, and together with a better management of the monetary policy could lead to greater scope in order to mobilize financing towards the productive sectors required by the region. In that sense, we feel that we should expand the toolbox of the monetary policy and coordinate fiscal and monetary policy so that we can finally have greater capability to generate and mobilize resources towards productive sectors of investment, which is the final challenge. And finally, what happens in the world also impacts us not only at the level of private capital markets, but also via the international financial architecture. And thus we begin, it is fundamental to change the governance of international financial institutions with a greater participation of developing countries to improve the mechanisms to resolve sovereign debt. The UN has been working and generating several proposals in this sense to reduce and improve the risks, the financial risks of financial sustainability, especially when we include climatic risks, and to improve, of course, the capability for loans of development banks. That is a central aspect and another issue that we have been discussing for many years, and hopefully we can make a better use of that is to recycle the special issue rights that can also become an important source of financing, productive financing for the region. So how can we go about doing this? Because ECLAC, within its overview of expanding the scope for growth, asks not only what, but also how. And in the previous slide, we looked at the whats and some of the hows. Now, within the hows that are presented in the overview and which relate to macroeconomic management of institutions, we mentioned the need to strengthen what ECLAC has called the TOPP capabilities. And in technical terms, we have to strengthen the framework for management of public policies with a comprehensive outlook on the mobilization of public and private financial resources. We must continue to venture on public-private initiatives to improve the fiscal sustainability frameworks and the governance of those frameworks of fiscal sustainability. And in operative terms, we need to develop comprehensive systems to better analyze and assess the use of the financing of policies with policies in key development areas, which will improve the evaluation of the use of sectorial sectors. And that has been the logic of the productive development policy that ECLAC has been promoting lately. And the need to improve taxation revenues, for example, in political terms, to strengthen coordination and coherence mechanisms between fiscal policies, monetary policies, exchange policies, and prudential, to adopt common regional positions vis-a-vis the international financial architecture and other events that are happening at a multilateral level. All those are essential in order to generate more scope for growth. And finally, the countries permanently develop future scenarios in order to make decisions and adapt their policy structures in view of how they perceive the future. And finally, ECLAC has recently launched a new flagship on development policies to expand sectors and productivity, and that leads us to expand the scope for policies within this field. ECLAC has put forward the idea of not only looking at industrial sectors, but to define a wide range of boosting sectors that go beyond industry. The need to understand that these are collaborative, multifactorial, and multi-level policies. We need to combine horizontal and vertical efforts in the implementation of these policies, and this has to do, for example, with the cluster initiatives that are being discussed lately. A better balance between policies from top down with bottom-up policies. This has to do with decentralization and decentralization in the use of resources. That is an important issue, and to improve the governance of this field when it comes to productive development policies, and of course an approach related to internationalization, which is very close to the export focus that the region has had for many years. And within this framework, it has chosen and put forward the need to bet on certain sectors. And among the sectors that we have raised in the portfolio of sectors is industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the industry of medical devices, advanced manufacturing, the issue of services, the export of modern services or ICTs, a society of care, and the economy of care, intensive services in labor, the digital government, and the main environmental challenge means that we have to face up to environmental issues, which in turn promotes growth. And we have circular economy, high electromobility, the issue of renewable energies, and sustainable tourism, among others. In summary, then, the region has both good and bad aspects. It faces a low growth trap. Macro conditions are still restrictive, and the major challenge is how to be able to implement policies and enable us to mobilize financing in order to expand macro conditions, accompanied by productive development policies, enabling us to increase and diversify the productive, the exporting structure, exports, and productivity. We thank Daniel Titelman, Director of the Economic Development Division, and of course to our Executive Secretary that have mentioned the main aspects of this overview. Now we will answer some of the questions that have been sent to us by colleagues from the press. The first one is from the Bloomberg correspondent Daniel Salazar Castellanos, who asks, we are writing about the macro shocks that could be faced by Ecuador as a result of the energy crisis and the power cuts. How do you foresee the economic outlook for Ecuador in 2025, and what impact could this have on growth? Executive Secretary, I offer you the floor. Yes, thank you very much, Daniel Salazar from Bloomberg, for your question. Indeed, the energy crisis in Ecuador is casting a shadow on the economy of the country. The severe drought, which is considered the worst in more than 60 years, has forced the government to implement power cuts, even 14 hours per day, and that has led to significant losses in industrial and trade sectors. And this is reflected in the slowdown of the growth of Ecuador between 23 and 24, with a move from 2.4 to 0.8. ECLAC projects a rate of growth of the GDP for 2025 in this graph that was presented by Daniel Titelman of 1.4%, which would be an improvement compared to the 0.8%, which is expected for 2024. And that represents a more favorable international perspective, less global inflationary pressures, the strengthening of trade links with China after Ecuador signed a free trade agreement, and the first positive impacts of that type of agreement. A sustained contribution of the private sector to economic sector and moderate growth in the export of goods favored by a recovery of external demand. However, there are risks that could impact this forecast, such as the possibility of continuing with the effects of the energy crisis, the increase of the payments of the external debt, possible repercussions of the tariff policy by the US, depending on how that becomes a reality, the impact of the closure of operations, oil operations of ITT, and the lack of structural and other disincentives, which is labor informality and other. Among others. These are the main challenges faced by Ecuador in the midterm. What we need, Ecuador needs to diversify its energy matrix, which relies at present on 72% on hydropower that has always been regarded as a sustainable source, but as a result of climate change and the rainfall patterns, a country with that dependency will still be vulnerable to possible droughts or extreme climatic events that could lead to recurrent energy crises. That is basically our perspective on this issue of the energy crisis in Ecuador. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now we move on to the question by Roberto González, economics editor of newspaper La Jornada of Mexico. He sends two questions. First of all, whether you believe that the policy of the Mexican government in recent years to face up to poverty and inequality is sustainable over time, or if not, what adaptations do you feel are needed to continue to make headway with those two issues? And what are the scenarios for Latin America and the Caribbean vis-a-vis the imminent change of administration in the US in January? Would an alternative be to have closer relations with China? That is a question of Roberto González, editor of economics of newspaper La Jornada of Mexico. Executive Secretary. Thank you, Roberto González, for those two major and important questions. The first one on the sustainability of social policies in Mexico. Well, we would have to begin by saying that the government of Mexico has made significant efforts over the past few years in order to reduce poverty, especially via social policies such as the sustained increase of the minimum wage that increased by 182% between 2018 and 2024, and different transfers that have especially benefited the elderly, pensioners, through the universalization of pensions, and young people. Social expenditure in Mexico represents around 13% of the GDP, benefiting more than 30 million Mexicans, and have made a very significant contribution in terms of reducing inequality and poverty, which is reflected in the figures. The new government of President Claudia Sheinbaum has mentioned that she will strengthen transfers via programs such as the support for women aged between 60 and 64 years of age, the universal grant that will be implemented progressively, and also for students in different levels of education. For 2024-2025, we expect that Mexico will have a moderate economic growth, 2.2 and 2.4 in 2025, and we expect likewise a positive evolution of the minimum wage, which would also moderately promote the revenues of Mexican families. At 2.4 or 2.2 that is estimated, it does not consider any negative impact of the possible tariffs that have been announced by the next president of the US.
With official data of Coneval, although the poverty situation went down significantly from 2022, from 44 to 36%, still there are tremendous lags. But there was an 8 points improvement between 20 and 22. And now Mexico should ensure the financial sustainability, and that wouldn't be easy in a low growth context like the one I've described. And this leads to a conversation to promote active employment policies, productive development policies, where Mexico has a privileged position in order to leverage the nearshoring, has tremendous industrial complexity with tremendous advance. And it's also important for Mexico to move towards fiscal progressive situation. Most of the collection comes from VAT, whilst the income tax collection is low in a complex of high inequality. So there is an important agenda point there. Also bear in mind that in 2024, the financial requirements of the public sector or the committed expenditure are equivalent to 6% of GDP. And you need to add to that in 2024, the public debt is 50.2% of GDP, an important increase as compared to 2023, where it was 46.8. All of this makes necessary to have a comprehensive revision of expenditure strategies, fiscal situation in order to provide sustainability in the medium and long term to the economic strategies and social policies. As I said, the second question is also very important. What are the scenarios for Latin America and the Caribbean in view of the change in administration in the U.S. in January? This is a question without an easy answer because it's quite fluent. I mean, one thing is the announcements made by the candidate in the campaign, and something else would be concrete measures adopted by President Trump. Now, the impacts in Latin America and the Caribbean can be different depending on the country because there are different trade, investment, remittance structures. Having said that, one first area is that of trade. There you need to distinguish on the one side most of the South American countries that have as most important trade partners China and the EU, and therefore the US is the second or third place. It's important, but not the first or second. And in the case of Mexico and Central America and some Caribbean countries, where the United States is by far the main trade partner. So from that perspective, Mexico is the most vulnerable country because 84% of its goods exports go to the U.S. and therefore there's an important involvement of supply chains. Now, if President Trump implemented a 10% tariff, the Mexican exports and investment would be affected, leading to a GDP growth of 0.8 and 1 percentage point less than in a scenario of 10%. Now, if the tariff were greater, the impact would be greater. And now, the U.S. is the main destination point for exports and are vulnerable vis-a-vis trade restrictions. That's one issue. The second issue is that the same countries that are vulnerable for trade, they're also vulnerable insofar as remittances of migrants living in the United States, which is an important source for consumption. Nicaragua, Salvador, and Honduras receive more than 20% of GDP. And of course, this will impact these flows, although this will depend on what type of prior negotiation measures are adopted. So details of how those measures and magnitude. And the third important element is that several of the measures announced by President Trump could be inflationary for the U.S. economy and as a consequence for other countries. Now, the countries of deportations would reduce labor force and would raise salaries. 3.3% of the population of the U.S. are illegal migrants, and therefore the process would be reversed, that of make the process slower, and that would have effects in financial global markets and also in the region. And for the same reason, the space for maneuver of central banks to reduce monetary policy position. There are a series of effects in terms of trade policies with migrations and some macroeconomic aspects and interest rates, including also an impact on a possible reduction or at least restriction of the fiscal space in Latin American countries to the extent that monetary policy rates do not go down as it has been the trend so far. And finally, an important subject in trade, migration, and remittances is what type of policy will the U.S. implement as to China contention? Will be one of contention, or there could be other approaches? The risk is that the Latin American countries and Caribbean countries may have to choose. And countries that have a strong relations of technology exchange or trade with China, that could lead to frictions and complex problems to handle. In some, scenarios are multiple, are complex, and will depend on what policies and what sequence will they be adopted by the administration. Will there be prior negotiations? Will there be announcements without any negotiation or consultation? Thank you. Thank you. Now, as to the question by Marilina Costa Guzman from from Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and asks the following question. Dominican Republic is having a good growth. How can the country provide sustainability to the future, and how to make it inclusive, promoting equality? That is the question of Maria Elena Costa Guzman from the journal Hoy from Dominican Republic. Thank you very much, Maria Costa. For 2024 in ECLAC, we say that the Dominican Republic will have a growth of 5.2, will be one of the highest growers. For 2025, 4.6 is forecasted as a growth rate for Dominican Republic, and therefore you would be one of the countries of highest growth in the region. Now, also, the growth rate has been above the average of the region. Great performance of Dominican economy. There's not one single factor or recipe. If there was one, many countries would be following Dominican Republic, and that is not happening. One of the basic elements of our diagnosis of the region is that the region is, as we said it, and Daniel said in his report, we see the region subsumed in a low growth capacity. And however, we know about the conditions that generate growth and also that mark or affect negatively growth. And those studies show that there are three central factors associated to high growth rates. First, dynamic processes of productive transformation and increase of productivity. Second, higher public and private investment. And third, quality of labor force. And that, of course, has an effect on access to education and professional training. In ECLAC, we have had reports on productivity so as to have not only more productivity, more inclusiveness and sustainability. We have presented a whole overview of these policies, including a new report on the view of productive policies in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we will continue to publish every year. It's not a matter of growing just because of growing, but growing, generating social inclusion, employment with less pollution and damage to the environment and the planet. And thus, there are a series of recommendations there, summarized by Daniel at the end of the report. A central element is the need to make sectoral focuses. We suggested certain sectors as a portfolio of dynamic sectors or creating dynamics, and Dominican Republic is proved that this pays. There have been sectoral contributions like tourism, manufacturers for export, medical devices. Your Dominican Republic is very robust in that area and in other sectors, and supplemented all this by social policies. Not everything can be productive development, but that allows for sound, sustainable financing of social policies. I conclude inviting to read the last report, or one of the last reports, Latin America and the Caribbean facing development traps, indispensable transformations, where we address precisely those factors. Thank you. Now, there are two questions that Maria Martinez Moore, correspondent of EFE, has sent. The first, how will the region be affected by the protectionist or isolationist perspective announced by President-elect Donald Trump starting January? And the second one, if in January 10th, the Venezuela crisis is not solved, all international agencies forecast a new wave of Venezuelan migrants to Latin American countries. How this new possible exodus can impact the growth of the region. From EFE, Martinez Moore. Thank you, Maria Martinez Moore. How the possible protectionism swing will affect the region? I answered about possible scenarios. Perhaps what I would like to reiterate, if President Trump places 25% tariffs as announced to all the imports coming from Mexico and Canada, in spite of the free trade agreement, or the imports coming from other countries, this indeed would have potentially devastating effects on these countries. It's not a minor issue. These effects not only on those countries, but on the U.S. itself, because there would be disruptions in the exports, in the supply chains, of which many leading companies, even automotive industry in the U.S. depend on that, and it could have inflationary effects. And the same thing as to the migration effect. But a point I would like to add, which is very important, because at the end of 2025, the 10th Summit of the Americas will be held in Dominican Republic, including all the countries of the region and the United States and Canada. So it's to say that the most positive policies in the United States towards the region would be those that, instead of aggravating this low growth capacity trap for countries that we have explained, and when aggravating the poverty, the inequality, violence, and migration situation through tariffs or other restrictive measures for growth, the most positive policies would be the ones that will invite opportunities of economic growth, technological, industrial partnerships, sectoral ones, and combine that with subjects like fighting organized crime, citizen insecurity, improvement in education. A partnership defined on that foundation, on those bases, which are causes of immigration, would be the most effective way to reduce immigration, organized crime, and other situations that Latin America and Caribbean, US and Canada are all interested in solving. It would be an approach of cooperation and partnership, and not one of conflict. We need to see what is the road to be taken in hemispheric cooperation. And one example would be the Summit of the Americas to be held in Dominican Republic next year. Now, the subject of Venezuela. If the crisis is not solved, will there be a new wave of migration? We need to be careful when evaluating this situation. Several conditions and several sources are evaluated. Yes, there are different estimates that forecast higher migration floats Venezuelans to the rest of the continent if the crisis is not solved. Therefore, there is a systemic interest in that this crisis be solved. The most reliable data tell us that in December 2024, refugees and migrants of Venezuela were almost 8 million, of whom 6.7 were in other countries of Latin America. For example, in Colombia, 2.8 million. The largest amount of Venezuelans in a different Latin American country. Many left during the economic crisis, but it's not an issue only of economic crisis. It also has political dimensions. Now, the challenge is for Venezuelans, government and opposition, to generate political, economic, social conditions that will enable Venezuelans to have an economy, a prosperous economy, and with a sense of social cohesion and mobilization, improving the quality of life of Venezuelans. And that would be the root solution of this external flow of Venezuelan migrations.
Muchos estudios demuestran que cuando se facilita la integración de los migrantes a los mercados laborales y a los sistemas educativos y de salud, es decir, se les integra con respeto a los derechos humanos, los beneficios sobre cualquier costo. De manera que es importante.
And therefore, it's important to face up to the challenge of immigration with this positive mentality. This is what we always insist upon in ECLAC with regards to the human rights of migrants, with regards to their integration. Most of these people are people that act in good faith and that are escaping from personal risk situations for both them and their family, of course. There are people that are not people that act in goodwill, but this is something that we must manage adequately. Thank you very much. Thank you, Executive Secretary. The Prensa Latina Agency, via its correspondent Carmen Esquivel, asks the following question. Well, more than one question, and one of them has already been answered, but I convey that, as has been sent to us, the U.S. President announced an increase of tariffs against several countries. How could these measures impact the region? But she also asks about projections for this and for next year, in the sense that economic growth will be low, a trend that has existed for many years now. What does the Commission recommend in order to truly change the situation and promote growth? The questions by Carmen Esquivel from Prensa Latina Agency. Executive Secretary. Thank you, Carmen Esquivel. Indeed, the question on the increase of tariff measures by the new U.S. administration is something that we have discussed at length. Now, with regards to the issue of projections and what is it that we recommend in order to change that situation, well, thank you very much. Indeed, that is one of the main messages that we have mentioned with the region in three traps: a low growth trap, and an eloquent data is that over the last decade the growth was 0.9 to 1%, which is half of the 2% which was the rate of growth during the famous lost decade. And if we continue along this path, we risk a new lost decade, and that is something that we must prevent. And therefore, we need to change the situation in order to promote growth, which involves productive transformations and all the other transformations that are required. Now, for this, there is no magic wand. There are no single solutions, but a central element that we are highlighting is the need to have productive development policies. We need much more ambition and escalation in terms of these productive development policies. Now, this not only implies learning from Asian countries. Within countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, we have very successful cases of clusters of medical devices, of aerospace industries, of agricultural machinery in Argentina, of transformations towards renewables and so on and so forth that have adopted cluster approaches and that have been imbued with all the success factors. So it's possible to reproduce that, and our recommendations are not only to reproduce that but to expand that, putting governance at the forefront and not subsidies at the forefront. And this means that what we're recommending are policies, productive development policies, and that is why they're called such, that do not add simply subsidies, which is an older type of industrial policy, but rather encourages a collaboration between private, public companies and the academic sector in order to develop sectorial productive agendas. We're talking here of policies that have tremendous synergies, and we must make joint decisions with science, development and innovation policies, digital transformation policies, startups, environments, human talent promotion, and the financing and the attraction of investments. In other words, what we're recommending is that as countries, we must move towards a culture that promotes that type of development and that type of productive development. And that is something that can only be achieved via very strong strategic alliances with the private sector, with the academia, and with other sectors, building also as from territories. As has already been mentioned, we have identified 14 boosting sectors that have a tremendous potential, not only in order to boost, but in order to transform situations towards greater environmental sustainability and inclusion. And we have emphasized at the House that lead us to the institutional frameworks, the institutional and governance capabilities in order to make the management of that a major productive transformation effective. And of course, we have the issue of the mobilization of resources that we highlight in this report. There are two major fronts there: the mobilization of domestic resources, which involves taxation reforms, the strengthening of public finances, changes in order to make the taxation structure more progressive, and also measures in terms of expenditure, and of course the whole agenda of to mobilize external resources so that the UN system in the compact for the future, and also during the G20 meeting, there is a clear agenda in place that includes the reforms to international governance, the mobilization or recirculation of special issue rights, schemes to restructure the debt of middle-income countries, greater capitalization and the impact of development banks, and so on. And what is important here is that we have already defined what it is that has to be done. However, we need to determine how we can do that. And therefore, it's important for Latin American countries to get involved and exert influence in these international fora. There is a major meeting that will be held in Seville, Spain next year, precisely around this issue of how to mobilize greater international resources for development and the reform of the international financial architecture. Thank you. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Our colleague from Bloomberg, Daniel Salazar, who had already sent a question on the impact of the energy crisis in the performance of Ecuador, also had several other supplementary concerns that I would like to convey to you all. One of them was what are the economic sectors that can take off in Latin America in 2025, whether this will be the year of green energy and its consolidation. What explains the growth of Venezuela this year over and above the regional average? And what will its performance rely on in 2025, and the risks involved? How far can the development of the economy in Guyana be maintained, and why you expect a slowdown in that growth down to 41.5%. And what are the main challenges for Latin America and the Caribbean in 2025? These are supplementary questions by Daniel Salazar from Bloomberg that we had not yet asked you. Executive Secretary. Thank you. I'll answer only one question, and after that, Daniel Titelman will be able to answer the other questions. And I'll answer this very briefly. What are the economic sectors that can take off in 2025, and what explains that?
difícil decir un
Well, it's
sector
very
económico
difficult to say one economic sector for the whole region because economic sectors or the dynamics of this
son muy,
uh,
muy grandes. Así que esto
are
es algo que
very heterogeneous, and therefore this is something that can be discussed more at the level of each country.
predecir
But beyond predicting, as if we had a crystal ball of which sectors could take off or not next year, is to go back to our recommendation of the portfolio of boosting sectors, because what is
a
important
menos que
here
haya,
is,
bueno, como lo hubo en cierto momento
well,
cuando China estaba
unless, of course,
creciendo
when China was growing at a rate of 9 or 10%, and when we had a world demand that was increasingly high, in the case of China, that is not going to happen, and nor in any other country experienced by mining sectors or by food sectors. Well, that could explain sectors that grow. But basically, these are commodity booms that have a cycle that last for a specific period of time and then disappear. What is important with regard to sectors is this message that we have to do our homework, the development of sectors. Mexico does not have an aerospace sector, a different one for vehicles, others for softwares or medical devices. As a result of spontaneous generation. No, they worked on cluster policies. This involved public private collaboration, free trade agreements. So there were policies in order to establish productive links. Likewise, in the Dominican Republic, with many of the leading sectors, and also in my own country with leading sectors. And that is why this indication of boosting sectors that include issues such as medical devices, pharmaceutical, and life science industries, the export of services enabled via internet, the great thrust towards sustainability involving energy transition, electromobility, the circular economy, the bioeconomy, the sustainable use of water, sustainable tourism. So the issue is, yes, it's important to bet on these sectors. There are very clear formulas of how to do this adequately. It is not extremely difficult. And again, the idea is not to put subsidies in the front, but rather governance in the front. That is our recommendation in order to escape from a third lost decade and this low growth capability trap that many countries find themselves in. Thank you. Executive Secretary, now I offer the floor to Daniel Titelman so that he can answer the question on what explains the growth in Venezuela this year. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel Salazar, for that question. In the preliminary overview, we anticipated that the Venezuelan economy will grow at a rate of around 6.2% this year, and that is primarily the result of the increase in oil production, that this year has increased by 16% compared to the same period last year. At present, we have also found positive signals in the reactivation of goods and trade sectors, and also the pharmaceutical industry, and also an increase in the repatriation of funds that enables private consumption. That is the context that explains these projections that we have for this year. This favorable performance of the Venezuelan economy, as mentioned, is primarily the response or is a result of the oil industry and reflects operations in Venezuelan oil fields on the part of American companies, given the greater flexibility of sanctions against the Venezuelan oil industry. That has enabled that some companies are already working on this. Despite that, the oil industry has also experienced a recovery with agro-industry and manufacturing. The availability of currency of foreign currency has enabled a greater production, and they have also promoted domestic consumption. For next year, we expect a growth of 3%, and these expectations are primarily the result of the return of operations of mixed PD, the PDVSA, and oil industry companies said that could even improve the refining capabilities that Venezuela has in order to produce oil, and could increase the productive capability in some areas outside of the capital region.
Condicionantes que hay detrás de esto. Bueno,
what are the conditions behind this? Well, we should maintain the flexibility imposed upon the Venezuelan sector, and especially upon the oil industry. We must also overcome restrictions in terms of the production capability that mixed companies have, subjected to certain supply and productive issues that they would have to overcome. And an important aspect in the Venezuelan economy is the control of inflation, despite the fact that inflation has dropped this year, and that has helped the economic recovery. Next year, it is expected that will continue to drop. An important explanation of this has to do with currency of the Venezuelan economy in order to maintain the exchange rate and maintain the management of currency.
Observando es que el aumento por divisa
And the increase by currency has increased, and that has led to a rise in the exchange rate, and that could affect the stability of the inflation and the forecast for growth of next year. Until when could last the outstanding performance of Guyana economy? A common point between the Venezuelan and Guyana economies is one common point is oil, and the growth of Guyana is the result of the discovery of oil. And what has generated an important growth this year is the expansion phase of Guyana's economy, especially in the production of oil in ships, in vessels. For next year, we will be generating a lower forecast, 13.5%, but it is a sound growth. What does Guyana need to maintain its growth rate? Well, what the secretary was saying, a strategic vision, a view of productive development policy, and move towards productive diversification that will leverage and give more resilience to the economy of the country. And as to Bloomberg's questions, I would have, what are the tailwinds and front winds for the economies in Latin America and the Caribbean? I'll be very brief. And given the answers of the executive secretary, there is an external context that is complex, with some degree of uncertainty, geopolitical and international inflation dynamics, with an impact on international interest rates and financing costs. Also, there is a reduction in the economic activity of the main trade partners of the countries of the region. That is the complex side. There are positive signs. World technological change favors raw materials and exports of the region. I would say that the region is, or the world is facing a complex geopolitical, difficult context, and you need to strike a balance of how things will be managed, as the secretary has said. Thank you, Daniel Titelman, for the Economic Development Division. And from AFP, Mr. Hernandez. The GDP of Argentina was contracted 3.2% in 24, but it is for a 4.3% growth is foreseen for 2025. This economic drive for next year is explained by the measures adopted by Javier Milei, the president in his first year of government. The question is of Axel Hernandez, AFP, Executive Secretary. Yes, thank you, Axel Hernandez, for that question. Very important one. What is happening in Argentina? In ECLAC, we forecast a growth of 4.3% for Argentina 2025, in line with the estimates of other international agencies and also private agencies that have been endorsed by the Central Bank of Argentina. This is explained by four factors. Yes, they have to do with the measures adopted by President Milei in the first year of government. First, recovery of real revenue and private consumption. During the second part of 24, a recomposition of real actual earnings was with positive effects on private consumption. I mean, it's different, the behavior in the first semester of this year and the second semester. The data published by INDEC on Monday last shows a growth of private consumption in the third quarter of 4.6 versus the previous quarter. And this trend could be sustained in 2025 to the extent that exchange stability is maintained and inflation goes on going down. A second factor is that non-conventional hydrocarbon reserves in the Pata Muerta geological formation and production there is growing, given the maturity of investments done in last years, positive expectation generated by fiscal incentives. The RIGI is known, that was approved in 24. The enter into operation or implementation of first gas pipe in Pata Muerte and also energy rates. A third factor is the rise of private loans and investment. Private credit. Several elements can incentivize private credit. Increase of bank liquidity given asset normalization in capital markets, exchange stability and low inflation. One of the lines with greatest potential is that of mortgage financing. That is in a reduced level vis-a-vis other countries of the region. And fourthly, the fourth element would be the positive statistical figures of 2024. The fact that there has been a recovery of the economy in the second semester of 2024 produces a positive statistical lag that is estimated in 2% of that 4.3% that is going to grow. This is a rebound effect after a low year of growth. And to end, we need to say that the effect of that growth in 2025 will be felt in a heterogeneous manner among different sectors, industries, and working groups. For example, at the level of sectors, you see an important growth of primary activities, slower in industry, trade, and so far, pensions and salaries of public sector and wages of informal workers were lagging behind given the recomposition of real actual salaries. There is at least a gap there. That is an effect of that. That would be our basic reading of how can you explain that estimate of 4.3% growth of the Argentinian economy for next year. Thank you, Executive Secretary. And the fact is that we have reached the end of time assigned to this launch and press conference. There are other questions, yes, and as usual, we'll try today to send you an answer in writing to the colleagues of the media that have sent questions that unfortunately we cannot address live. I'm referring Fabián Andrés Cambero from Reuters, Laberto Medillas of Valor Económico Brazil, Leticia Hernández from Financiero Mexico, Adrián Riveros, Universidad Weekly of San Jose, Costa Rica, among others, and through public information will contact you to send you the answers. All the material linked to this launching are available, is all available in the website of ECLAC, of CEPAL, and also the public information for those who would like to go into specifics or require other elements for your articles about the launch of this preliminary overview of the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean. Final message, Executive Secretary. Yes, thank you very much, Guido. Well, basically to say that always the end of a year and the beginning of the next one. In this case, it will be the end of the first 25 years, fourth of the next 25 years. It's important to reflect, to think, to look backwards and to look into the future of what is coming. In this preliminary overview of economies of Latin America and the Caribbean is a very complete exercise. I invite you to read the report. We have a reading, an interpretation of the global context of the spaces or restrictions for growth of the region. It is a very important subject given that we are in that low growth capacity trap. We have a review of economic activities with fundamental indicators. And of course, we have the exercise we do every year of how does it close each one of the countries as to growth and what are the expectations of growth for next year. All of this is concluded with the subject of what to do in this regard. There are powerful messages as the world's economy has very favorable growth for countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. That was in the past. This is not the time, but this time it is essential to do the homework of productive development, of social policies, of facing climate change, and implementing sustainable policies environmentally. All of them are important tasks. We will continue to think and reflect in CEPAL. We have a whole set of proposals, quite comprehensively, and we are convinced, and we know that many governments see this with great attitude. But the subject is move from words to action. There are the data, there are the institutional issues. So it's a pleasure once again. Thank you to all the team of the division and all the divisions, departments that have collaborated. And from ECLAC, this is the last flagship of the year 2024. See you in 2025. Thank you very much. And so with these words, we have concluded and reiterating our thanks to the media that have been with us and allow us to reach out to your public. Thank you very much for being with us. See you next year.